The slap cracked through the dining room like a rifle shot, and for 1 full second, nobody in the Ashford room breathed. Wine glasses froze halfway to open mouths. A waiter carrying a tray of oysters stopped mid-stride, the ice shifting audibly in the sudden silence. Brianna Calloway stood, with her palm still raised, chin tilted up, wearing the smile of a woman who had been told her entire life that consequences were something that happened to other people. The woman she had struck did not cry out. She did not stumble. She did not even raise a hand to her own cheek. She simply stood there, very still, the way a person stands when they have already decided how the story ends and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Brianna did not know it yet, but she had just made the single worst decision of her 27 years on Earth, and the woman in front of her was about to make one phone call that would end her father's career before the appetizers were cleared. Naomi Reeves had flown into Fairhaven on a Tuesday. She liked Tuesdays. Not the forced optimism of Monday, not the relief of Friday. Just Tuesday, plain and unbothered, asking nothing of you except that you show up and do the work. She'd rented a gray sedan at the airport, cracked the windows, left the radio off, and driven into the city she used to call home with the particular quiet of someone cataloging what had changed and what hadn't. The row house where she grew up was still standing on the east side, though someone else's bicycle was chained to the porch railing now. The waterfront had been rebuilt with glass condos and a boardwalk that hadn't existed when she left at 18. Banners hung from every lamppost downtown, blue and white, reading Fairhaven, built to last, with the mayor's name stitched discreetly into the corner. Mayor Walter Calloway, 56 years old, silver hair, a jaw made for campaign photographs, and a smile that had gotten him re-elected once already, by a margin his own strategists privately called generous. He was 2 months from a second re-election, and his approval rating sat at 59%. Naomi had read every glowing profile written about him in the last year. She had also read a great many documents that were never meant to be read at all, and those were considerably more interesting. Walter Calloway's daughter, Brianna, had grown up never once needing to develop a personality of her own, because the world had always been so eager to bend around the one she already had. She was pretty in the specific, expensive way that photographed well, and at 21 she'd tried modeling for 8 months, which she now described, depending on the audience, as either an artistic calling or a savvy business pivot. It was neither. What she actually had was a gift for spending money and an instinct for identifying which people could be useful to her, and she moved through Fairhavens, country clubs, and gala circuits like a woman who had never once considered that a room might not be built for her comfort. The stories about her didn't often make the papers. A server screamed at so badly in 2021 that he quit before his shift ended. Parking attendant, whose car she'd hit and driven away from, until a call from City Hall made the report disappear. A former friend who tried to go public about something that happened at a charity gala and then, mysteriously, stopped returning reporters' calls altogether. These things got managed. That was simply what it meant to be Walter Calloway's daughter in Fairhaven. Naomi had not come back to town because of Brianna. She had come back because of a man named Desmond Ortiz, who had spent 11 years as deputy director of the city's infrastructure procurement office, before being quietly moved to a windowless desk with no staff and no authority. The kind of demotion designed to make a man disappear without technically firing him. Desmond had reached out through a mutual contact 4 months earlier. He had documents. He had emails. Most importantly, he had 11 years of institutional memory that lived inside a man who took meticulous, obsessive notes precisely because he understood that memory fades and paper doesn't. Naomi had spent those 4 months building the file, cross-referencing contract numbers, tracing shell companies through 3 states, until the picture stopped being a suspicion and became a certainty. Tonight she was meeting Desmond at the Ashford Room, his choice. Because he said it's the last place in the city anyone would think to look for a whistleblower and a journalist having dinner. Naomi had agreed and privately thought it was also exactly the kind of place where, if something went wrong, there would be no shortage of witnesses. She arrived at 7:40, gave her name, and was seated in the quiet back section, reserved for people having conversations they didn't want overheard. She ordered water, checked her phone. Desmond was 12 minutes out, and folded her hands on the white tablecloth to wait, the way she had learned to wait for the moments that mattered most, because they never arrived on schedule. She felt Brianna Calloway enter before she saw her, the way a room's temperature shifts when a certain kind of person walks into it. Brianna came in with 5 friends, all dressed for an audience, trailing perfume and laughter that was slightly too loud to be accidental. The host greeted her by name. She didn't thank him. She scanned the room the way a general reviews a battlefield, and her eyes caught on Naomi and stopped there. The way eyes stop on something that doesn't fit the categories a person has already built for the world. Naomi noticed. She returned her attention to her water glass and said nothing. Brianna's table was seated 2 away, close enough that their conversation drifted over in waves. Names dropped for effect, a story about somebody's yacht, a joke that landed too hard on purpose. Brianna ordered champagne without glancing at the list, and somewhere between the first glass and the second, her eyes kept drifting back to Naomi's table with the particular, deliberate weight of someone working up to something. I didn't realize this section had, an open-door policy now, Brianna said, not quite to her friends, not quite to the room, but clearly loud enough to be heard by both. One of her friends laughed, the practiced laugh of someone who always laughed on cue. Naomi said nothing. She didn't look up. Looking up would be an invitation, and she had no interest in extending one. She wanted Desmond. She wanted the drive he was bringing. She wanted this evening to end quietly in a hotel room with a legal pad and several hours of uninterrupted thought. But Brianna Calloway had never once in her life learned how to leave a silence alone. She made another comment, something about certain people and standards, and this time she stood, crossed the space between the tables in 4 unhurried steps, and planted herself at Naomi's shoulder with the champagne still in her hand. "Excuse me," she said. "Syrup sweet, pitched for the room. I think you're a little lost. This section's reserved." Naomi looked up and met her eyes. "I have a reservation." Something flickered across Brianna's face. Not embarrassment, but recalibration. The look of a person recalculating a scenario that had gone off script. "This is the VIP section," she said, an edge sliding into her voice now. "I heard you the first time," Naomi said evenly. "The answer's the same." That was the part Brianna couldn't absorb. The flatness of it, the total absence of apology, the fact that this stranger wasn't shrinking. Her friends had gone quiet, phones already sliding out of pockets, sensing the temperature of the room the way people do right before something happens. Brianna's voice climbed, sharpened, spilled into a string of things about knowing your place. And who exactly do you think you are? Each sentence a little louder than the last, each one landing across a dining room that had gone completely, uncomfortably still. Naomi didn't raise her voice once. She said only, "I'm not moving," and that specific, unbothered refusal seemed to be the final thing Brianna's composure couldn't survive. Brianna's hand came up and across Naomi's face before anyone, including Brianna, seemed to fully register the decision being made. The sound was flat and absolute. 43 people would later give statements about what they saw next, and every one of them would describe the same thing. Naomi Reeves did not flinch, did not cry out, did not raise her voice. She reached up, touched the corner of her own mouth with 2 fingers, looked at her fingertips, and set her hand back down on the table like she was setting down a menu. Brianna stood there with her palms still half raised, the smile creeping back onto her face out of pure reflex. The automatic expression of someone who expected the world to simply absorb what she'd done and rearrange itself back into order, the way it always had. Naomi reached into her jacket, took out her phone, and dialed a number she knew from memory. "Renata," she said, her voice completely level. "It's time." "Yes, the Ashford room. I'll explain when you get here." A pause. "Thank you." She set the phone face down on the table and picked her water glass back up. "That's it?" Brianna said, a little too brightly, glancing at her friends for backup. "You're just going to sit there and make a phone call?" Someone at her table laughed on cue again, though it came out thinner this time. Naomi said nothing. She took a slow sip of water and waited. The next 9 minutes were the longest of Brianna Calloway's life, though she wouldn't understand that until they were already over. She went back to her table. She finished her champagne. She ordered another and laughed at her friend's jokes, though the laughter had changed texture, become effortful, the sound of someone performing calm while straining to hear something they couldn't yet name. At the 8-minute mark, one of her friends looked toward the entrance and stopped talking mid-sentence. At the 9-minute mark, Brianna looked too. 3 black SUVs had pulled up along the curb outside, engines cutting out in near unison. The people who stepped out of them moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who had already been briefed, who knew exactly where they were going, and simply hadn't been given the signal yet. 2 of them flashed credentials at the host without breaking stride. The rest of the restaurant had gone still in that particular way people go. Still when they sense something is happening that they don't yet have the words for, and the not knowing is somehow worse than knowing would be. Behind them walked a woman in her late 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped worrying decades ago about whether it looked intentional. She wore a dark blazer and low heels, and the unhurried calm of a person who had spent 30 years making difficult decisions in difficult rooms and had, somewhere along the way, simply stopped being rattled by any of it. She walked straight to Naomi's table, ignoring everyone else in the restaurant entirely. "Naomi," she said, and there was real warmth in it, the kind of respect that can't be performed, only earned. "Renata, thank you for coming." Naomi rose halfway, shook her hand. Brianna stared. She knew the face. She'd seen it in the kind of national news coverage that only ran when something serious was being announced. Renata Sloan. Special Federal Inspector General, appointed 18 months ago to head a task force investigating municipal corruption across half a dozen mid-sized American cities. Brianna's father had mentioned the appointment once, months ago, with a studied casualness that Brianna hadn't thought twice about at the time. She was thinking about it very hard now. Renata sat across from Naomi, opened a leather folder, and said in a low voice that still somehow carried, "Warrants signed. Teams staged outside. We can move tonight or tomorrow, your call." Naomi nodded once and began speaking, low and fast, and Renata listened with the focused attention of someone finally receiving information she'd been waiting a long time for. 2 tables away, Brianna Calloway felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. One of her friends leaned in and whispered, "Who is that?" Brianna didn't answer. She was doing the math, running every possible angle by which this evening still ended with her as the most important person in the room, and finding, for the first time in her life, that there wasn't one. The documents Naomi spread across the table that night told a story that had been building for 6 years. It began with a contract, the reconstruction of Fairhaven's aging water treatment system, awarded early in Walter Calloway's first term to a firm called Cornerstone Civil Group. The contract was worth $138 million. Independent engineering assessments Naomi had obtained through public records requests and confidential source interviews put the actual, honest cost of the work at closer to $86 million. The missing $52 million hadn't evaporated into cost overruns. It had been funneled through a chain of shell consultancies and advisory retainers into the pockets of 11 people. 7 of them tied directly to Walter Calloway's campaign infrastructure. 2 sitting on city boards Walter had personally appointed, and one of them his own brother-in-law, Roy Calloway, who ran a project management outfit 2 states away that, as far as Naomi could tell, had never actually managed a single project. That was only the first contract. There were 4 more behind it. Desmond Ortiz had known about all of them because he'd been in the room for everyone. Every meeting, every handshake, every decision made with minutes kept deliberately vague. He'd taken notes for 11 years, not out of malice, but out of the professional instinct of a man who understood that institutional memory is fragile, and paper is the only thing that survives a bad afternoon. He arrived at the Ashford, room 17 minutes after Renata Sloan, and sat down across from Naomi, with the stillness of a man who had made an expensive decision and had no intention of taking it back. He handed over an encrypted drive and a handwritten letter he called his formal statement. By then, Brianna had stopped pretending not to watch. She sat rigid, her second champagne untouched, as investigators moved quietly through the restaurant and outside the windows. More vehicles gathered in the unhurried formation of something already set irreversibly in motion. She heard her father's name spoken, not shouted, not accused, just said, the way you say a fact among other facts. Walter Calloway. She heard it and felt the floor of her whole life tilt an inch. Walter got the call at 11:40 that night, still in his study in his dinner jacket, reviewing polling numbers with his chief of staff. Strong numbers. The kind that made a second re-election feel like paperwork. He excused himself with the practiced ease of a man used to performing composure for subordinates, took the call standing at his window, looking out over the skyline he'd spent 6 years claiming credit for. He asked 3 questions. He said very little else. When he came back into the room, the chief of staff was still holding the polling sheet, and the number on it, 59%, would never again mean what it had meant an hour earlier. His first instinct was the instinct of a man who had spent his whole career making problems disappear. He called lawyers, 3 of them, 1 local, 1 from the capital, 1 personal attorney who'd handled sensitive matters for 15 years. He called in favors from council members and a federal liaison he'd assumed was permanently, quietly bought. He had his communications director draft statements calling the whole investigation a politically motivated smear campaign. An attack dressed up as accountability, a hit job against a reformer who'd made too many enemies by being effective. The statements were polished, confident, and said almost nothing specific, because specificity right now was dangerous. He also made a different kind of call. 2 witnesses tied to Desmond's evidence chain got visits from men they didn't recognize, men who spoke carefully worded sentences that stopped just short of a threat while making unmistakably clear what could happen if cooperation continued. One witness reported it to Naomi's team the same night. It went into the file under witness intimidation. A former procurement officer named Tanya Wallace, 22 years in city government, and not an easily rattled woman, got 3 anonymous texts over 2 days, and then a voicemail from a burner phone purchased in cash. She kept the voicemail and handed it straight to Renata Sloan's office. Naomi got her own version of pressure, an anonymous email routed through a shell server registered to a dummy LLC with a Fairhaven address, informing her that her investigative credentials were under review and that 2 complaints had been filed against her professional license. and that it would be in her personal and professional interest to redirect her attention elsewhere. She read it twice, forwarded it to Renata's office, and didn't respond. A colleague she respected called with a gentle suggestion that the Calloway story was getting politically complicated, that there were graceful ways to exit a story like this, that sometimes the smart move was the one that kept you in the game for the next fight. Naomi thanked her for the call and hung up, and sat for a long moment in the quiet of her hotel room thinking about her father. Elijah Reeves had worked 23 years for the Public Works Department in a different city, in a different state. Quiet, steady, and stubborn in a way that looked to some people like naivety, because he genuinely believed the systems built to hold power accountable actually meant something. In the spring of Naomi's sophomore year of high school, he found evidence of contract fraud in his own department. He reported it through the proper channels. The proper channels did nothing. He went higher. He went to the press. He lost his job, and in the months of legal and professional pressure that followed, he lost his health too, dying of a heart attack at 52. 4 years before the investigation he'd triggered finally closed. 4 years before the officials he'd named were charged. 4 years before anyone publicly said Elijah Reeves had been right all along. Naomi was 23 when that case finally closed. She read the announcement on her lunch break at a desk in Philadelphia and didn't cry, because she'd already done that grieving years earlier. What she felt instead was something clarifying, the way a lens sharpens when you turn it exactly one more click. She understood, in that moment, precisely what the rest of her working life was going to look like. She didn't tell that story often. She wasn't a person who traded on her own pain, but she carried it the way you carry anything load-bearing. Not in your hands, not on display, just structurally present in everything you build. She went back to work. The public hearing was set for a Thursday in October, a joint oversight session with federal participation under Renata Sloan's office, held in a civic center auditorium, built to seat 300. Every seat filled an hour early. Walter Calloway arrived with his legal team and its communications director wearing a charcoal suit and his campaign blue tie, greeted at the entrance by a knot of supporters holding hand-painted signs that read "Stand with Walter." He smiled, for the cameras like this was a rally instead of a federal proceeding. He spoke first, for 11 minutes, calling the investigation political vengeance, a coordinated smear by interests threatened by his reform record, an attempt to silence a public servant who dared hold powerful people to account. He was, in terms of pure performance, very good. Steady voice, well-placed pauses, eye contact with the cameras in the back of the room. In the gallery, his supporters nodded along. The room held its breath. Then Naomi stood up. She spoke for just under 50 minutes, and she'd learned a long time ago that the most persuasive delivery was also the most restrained one. No theatrics, no flourishes, just documents, dates, numbers, and names laid out in a sequence built so that every fact could be independently verified by anyone in the room who cared to check. She walked through each of the 5 contracts. She traced each payment through its shell structure to its final resting place. She put the procurement emails up on the overhead screens, specific, dated, written in the careless, unguarded language of people who believed no one would ever read them. She named all 11 people who'd profited. She named their ties to Walter Calloway. She read Desmond Ortiz's formal statement into the record, while Desmond himself sat 2 rows behind her in his best suit and nodded once when his name was called. Several committee members had walked in with a skeptical posture of people expecting a political stunt. By the 40-minute mark, most of them had stopped looking skeptical. One council member who'd stood beside Walter through 3 campaign cycles asked to be excused during the recess and never came back. Brianna sat in the gallery. She'd come out of the same stubborn loyalty that makes a child show up for a parent, even after everything. Sitting beside her aunt, who'd driven 4 hours because she loved the family, even if she'd never fully trusted Walter. Brianna watched her father speak and felt the old, familiar pride curdling against something colder that had been sitting in her chest since the night at the Ashford room. Then, she watched Naomi stand, watched the committee's faces shift, watched the screens fill with numbers and names, and somewhere in the second half of that presentation, she recognized her uncle's company. She'd known Cornerstone had city contracts. Her father had described it once, years ago, as a good local business doing good local work, and she had chosen, deliberately, not to think about it any further, because there are things you don't examine when your entire life is built on someone else's reputation. She recognized other things, too. Dates lining up with conversations she'd half overheard through closed doors. Names she'd seen flash across her father's phone at dinner. The particular shape of a truth she'd spent years successfully avoiding. She didn't cry in the hearing room. She sat perfectly straight, face still, and watched the whole structure of her life come apart in real time, the way you watch an accident you can't stop. At the recess, she walked to the nearest bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, and looked at her own reflection for a long time without recognizing much of what looked back. The final witness hadn't been announced. She appeared after a brief closed conversation between Renata Sloan and the committee chair, introduced only as a former member of the mayor's executive staff. Her name was Priya Nandan. 31 years old, she'd worked 3 years as an executive assistant inside Walter Calloway's inner office, before resigning without public explanation 9 months earlier. She carried a small recorder in a protective case, connected it to the auditorium's sound system, and pressed play. 40 seconds of audio followed. Clear ambient room noise. Then a voice every person in that auditorium had just spent 11 minutes listening to. The same voice that had called this whole investigation a politically motivated fabrication. In the recording, Walter Calloway didn't sound indignant. He sounded brisk, specific, businesslike. He gave clear instructions for how a contract would be steered to a chosen company, and how the money would then be distributed to a list of named recipients on a set schedule. He mentioned a dollar figure, he mentioned a timeline, and he said one phrase, "Handle it the way we handled the Riverside job," that lined up exactly with the contract Naomi had already walked the room through an hour earlier. The room went completely silent when the recording ended. Walter sat frozen at the respondent's table for several long seconds before leaning in to confer with his attorney, who immediately requested a recess. It was granted. Walter walked out of the hearing room surrounded by his legal team, looking straight ahead, not once glancing toward the gallery, not once toward his daughter. Brianna watched him go and felt, for the first time, something entirely separate from the girl who had raised her hand in a restaurant 2 weeks earlier. Something that felt disturbingly close to shame. His communications director issued a statement that evening, calling the recording potentially fabricated and promising a vigorous legal response. The response never fully materialized. By morning, 2 of Walter's largest campaign donors had suspended their support, pending the outcome of the investigation. By noon, his own party's state chair had issued a statement urging full cooperation with federal investigators. By 3 that afternoon, 4 city council members, who'd been reliable allies for years, had publicly distanced themselves from his office. His approval rating, 59% before the hearing, wasn't measured publicly again for weeks, but internal party polling, later leaked to reporters, showed it had collapsed to 19% within 7 days. He resigned on a Monday morning. In a short written statement, his communications director read aloud at a podium, because Walter didn't show up to read it himself. Reporters who'd covered his administration for years sat with their recorders running and wrote down, more than anything he actually said, what he didn't say. No apology. No acknowledgement of harm. The statement cited wanting to focus on family and letting the city move forward without distraction. It never once used the word sorry. But Walter's fall wasn't the end of it, and this is the part that made the story different from every other disgraced official headline that had ever run in Fairhaven. 2 weeks after the resignation, a federal grand jury handed down its first round of indictments, and one of the names on the list was Brianna Calloway. Not for the fraud itself. Investigators found no evidence she'd known the scale of it while it was happening. But in the 72 hours after the last made national headlines, when reporters started circling her father's name, Brianna had done something reckless. She'd called 2 of the 7 campaign-linked recipients named in Naomi's file and told them, panicked, to get their stories straight before investigators reached them. One of those calls had been recorded, not by the FBI, but by the recipient himself, a man named Corbin Hayes, who was already quietly cooperating with Renata Sloane's office and had turned the recording over the same week. Obstruction of a federal investigation. A lesser charge than her father's, but a federal charge, all the same, with her name printed under his in every headline that ran that week. Brianna Calloway did not fight it. Against the advice of one of the same expensive attorneys her father had hired, she pleaded guilty. She stood in front of a federal judge in a gray suit, with no cameras allowed inside the courtroom, and said, when asked if she had anything to add before sentencing, that she had made the call out of fear for her father, and out of a lifetime of assuming that consequences were things that happened to other people, and that she understood now, fully, that they didn't. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, and a formal restitution order tied to the broader case. It was not prison. Reporters who'd expected a harsher outcome called it lenient, but it was the first time in Brianna Calloway's 27 years that a room full of strangers had told her no, and meant it, and made it stick. She lost everything else gradually, and then, all at once, the way people usually do, lose the things that were never really theirs to begin with. The friends from the Ashford room scattered within weeks, the way people who'd always been calculating simply recalculated. The invitations slowed and then stopped. The video of the slap, captured on 3 phones and circulating within the hour, became the image permanently stitched to her name, and no statement, no lawyer, no apology tour could pry it loose. She stopped going to the places she used to go. She sat alone in an apartment that suddenly felt enormous and understood, for the first time, what it means to be surrounded by a life built entirely for a version of yourself that no longer exists. Her 400 community service hours were assigned to a legal aid clinic on the south side of Fairhaven, the kind of place with a waiting room that was always full, and a staff stretched thin enough that every case felt urgent to somebody. It was not a part of the city Brianna had ever spent real time in. She'd driven through it, once or twice, on her way to somewhere else, and never looked hard enough to actually see it. They had no choice. She was not good at the work, not at first. She made mistakes rooted in assumption. She talked when she should have, listened. She offered solutions to problems she hadn't taken the time to actually understand. She was corrected, sometimes gently and sometimes not, and she learned, slowly, badly, and then a little better, that the most useful thing she could do in most rooms was be quiet, be attentive, and show up without expecting anything back. She had genuinely never understood, before that clinic, what it felt like to be present without an agenda. She was still learning. She stayed anyway, long after her 400 hours ran out. 6 weeks into her probation, She found Naomi through a mutual contact and asked, without explaining why, if Naomi would be willing to meet her. Naomi agreed, which surprised even Naomi a little. They met at a coffee shop on the east side, the unremarkable kind of place where nobody looks up when the door opens. Brianna arrived first, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and spent 12 minutes rehearsing and discarding every version of what she wanted to say. When Naomi walked in and sat down across from her, Brianna looked at her directly. Not as a category, not as an obstacle, just as a person sitting across a table, and said, "I'm not here because I want anything from you. I just needed you to hear me say it to your face. What I did was wrong, not just the slap. The whole way I looked at you before I even opened my mouth. I know an apology doesn't undo any of it. I needed to say it anyway." She'd planned to say more, but found she'd said what actually needed saying, and stopped. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you coming," she said, her voice even, without performance. "I don't carry what happened as a wound. But I want you to understand something, because it matters more than the apology. What happened in that restaurant was never really about me. I could have been anyone that night. You made a decision about who I was and what I deserved based on nothing but how I looked and where I was sitting, and you acted on that decision in front of 43 people without a second of hesitation. That's the part worth sitting with. Not what happened to your father afterward. Not what happened to you. The half second before you raised your hand. That's the thing to actually examine." Brianna looked down at her coffee. "I know," she said quietly. "I've had a lot of time to think about it." "Good," Naomi said. "Power doesn't make anyone bigger. It just makes their choices louder. What actually makes a person worth something is how they treat people they have nothing to gain from." They sat with that for a while. When Brianna finally spoke again, her voice had lost the practiced polish it used to carry. "I want to do something useful," she said, "with whatever I've got left. I know how that probably sounds, like I'm trying to fix my image. I'm not. I just can't keep living a life that isn't for anybody but me." "Then do it," Naomi said simply. "Find something worth doing. Do it badly at first, and get better." Brianna did find something, and it took far longer and was far less dramatic than she'd imagined it would be, because it turned out that doing something genuinely useful rarely looks like anything at all. It looks like paperwork and early mornings and conversations with people who have every reason not to trust you yet. She stayed on at the legal aid clinic long after her court-ordered hours ended, eventually training incoming volunteers herself, teaching them the one lesson that had taken her a public humiliation and a federal guilty plea to learn: that the people in that waiting room did not exist to be managed, dismissed, or looked past. They existed exactly the way she did, and had simply never been treated that way by anyone who looked like her. Walter Calloway was indicted on 9 counts of fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice that winter. His trial was set for the following spring. 3 other city officials were indicted alongside him. Tanya Wallace received a formal commendation from Renata Sloan's office for her cooperation. Desmond Ortiz, who had paid a heavier personal price than almost anyone to bring the truth forward, received something quieter, but no less real: a handwritten note from Naomi and a formal letter from the federal office clearing his record and restoring, in writing, everything his 11 years of sideline service had actually been worth. Fairhaven appointed an interim mayor and launched a full review of every municipal contract awarded over the previous 6 years, a process expected to take a year and a half and almost certain to produce further indictments. The city's long-dormant ethics commission was reconstituted with 3 new independent members and real investigative authority. The original water treatment contract, the one with the $52 million hole in it, was reopened, rebid transparently, and awarded to an out-of-state firm at $41 million loss, less than Cornerstone had originally charged for the same unfinished work. Naomi didn't stay in Fairhaven to watch the trial unfold. That was never her role. She'd built the file, Renata's office, and the federal prosecutors would carry it the rest of the way. There were other cities waiting, other files quietly compiling themselves in the back of her mind, other legal pads and encrypted drives and long paper trails leading back to their hidden sources. She packed the rental car on a Friday morning and drove out of Fairhaven the same way she'd driven in, because it felt like the right way to leave. The banners had already come down from the lampposts, the ones that used to read Fairhaven, built to last with a name stitched into the corner that no longer meant what it once had. The bare poles stood in the morning light, waiting for whatever came next. She drove one last time past the row house on the east side, the one with the narrow porch, and sat in the car a while without getting out. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, with his folders spread under a yellow lamp, the house quiet except for the sound of his pen. He had believed stubbornly and completely that the systems built to hold power accountable actually meant something, and he hadn't been wrong. He'd just been early or alone, or trusting of channels that failed him, before better ones finally didn't. He never lived to see the truth surface. She couldn't undo that. But she could make sure it meant something, by making sure the next person who found themselves exactly where her father had stood didn't have to wait 4 years and lose everything just to be believed. She started the engine and pulled onto the highway, and behind her, Fairhaven caught the morning light across its new glass towers and its rebuilt waterfront, moving forward the way cities always do, indifferent to which version of themselves they'd end up becoming. She thought about the 40 seconds of audio that had done in under a minute, what months of careful documentation had built toward. She thought about Desmond Ortiz in his good suit, nodding once when his name was finally read into the record. She thought about Brianna Calloway in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she never drank, saying a true and necessary thing out loud to another person's face for what might have been the first time in her life. The highway stretched out flat and long ahead of her, leading toward whatever city came next. Whatever file was already quietly assembling itself somewhere in the back of her mind. Naomi turned the radio on for the first time since she'd landed, a small habit she only allowed herself on the way out, and drove into whatever came next with the windows down. The work continued. That was the thing about the work. It never asked to be remembered. It only asked to be finished.